I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. Minister, welcome to New York. We're very pleased to see you once again in the President's Chair of the UN Security Council. We'd also like to thank the Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs, Mr. Miguel de Serpa Suarez, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mr. Peter Maura, and Ms. Belal for their briefings. History has seen various different approaches to the problems of the law of armed conflicts. It's no secret that at one time war was thought to be a situation that was contrary to law and that was not subject to any regulation. This was expressed in the well-known Roman maxim, "In times of war, the law falls silent." Unfortunately, humanity needed several centuries and two of the most terrible armed conflicts in its history, which took place in the 20th century, to realize the need to humanize wars and to form a set of rules pertaining to its conduct. And this so that, among other things, those who do not directly participate in armed conflict are kept as safe as possible. Today we are meeting here to mark the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. These are documents that are the foundation of the contemporary law of armed conflicts. Our country made a substantial contribution to the development of these conventions, which substantially expanded the legal regulation of states' conduct in armed conflicts, and first and foremost when it comes to the protection of the civilian population. I would like to take this opportunity to recall another anniversary relating to international humanitarian law. In November last year in St. Petersburg, the Interparliamentary Assembly of the CIS and the ICRC organized a conference devoted to the 150th anniversary of the adoption, upon Russia's initiative, of the St. Petersburg Declaration, renouncing the use, in times of war, of explosive projectiles of 1868. This document established not only the idea of prohibiting inhumane forms of weaponry, but also excluding the civilian population and civilian objects from what are considered legitimate targets of war. Mr. President, when we speak of the significance and relevance of the Geneva Conventions, we also need to recall the history behind their creation. I don't think it would be any exaggeration to say that the Geneva Conventions were the lesson that humanity learnt from the bitter experience of the Second World War. This war, which was unprecedented in its scale and brutality, was an immense tragedy for the peoples of Europe, Asia, and the entire world. The threat to the fundamental principles of civilization was prevented through colossal joint efforts and heavy losses. As we know, Germany essentially eschewed the norms of international law that existed at the time. Peaceful towns and the civilian population were bombed. Hitler's air and ground forces pursued a scorched earth policy. There was widespread use of mass deportations of the civilian population and the collective punishment of civilians allegedly for supporting partisans. At the same time, these collective punishments, as has been demonstrated by contemporary investigations and research, aimed, among other things, to reduce the total number of the population living on occupied territories in order to free up resources that were useful for the occupying power. There was widespread use of starvation as well as a means of waging war. The treatment of prisoners of war was particularly cynical. All of this took place in spite of the fact that between the parties to the conflict there were international obligations that were applicable at the time. Germany's mass and gross violation of its international obligations was the subject of sentencing of the Nuremberg Tribunal. At the same time, the defense of war criminals during the trial actively advanced the idea that the Hague rules for the waging of war that were based on the experience of 19th century wars were outdated. Moreover, the defendants actively referred to an absence of specific prohibitions when it comes to the treatment of the civilian population. Although the justifications that they provided did not allow them to escape responsibility, they raised once and for all the question of strengthening the international legal protection of the victims of armed conflicts, and it was in those conditions that the diplomatic conference was convened, which resulted in the 1949 Geneva Conventions. At the same time, following the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, it became clear that the developing means and methods of waging war, the emergence of new forms of conflict, such as national liberation wars, and the heightened attention of the international community to upholding human rights in any situations, dictated the need for the further codification, confirmation, and development of humanitarian law. This led to the adoption in 1977 of Additional Protocols 1 and 2 to the Geneva Conventions. Mr. President, allow me to cite the final resolution of the 1949 conference and remind states that participated in the development of the Geneva Conventions of the following. The conference wishes to affirm before all nations that its work, having been inspired solely by humanitarian aims, its earnest hope is that in the future governments may never have to apply the Geneva Conventions for the protection of war victims. Its strongest desire is that the powers, great and small, may always find a friendly settlement of their differences through cooperation and understanding between nations, so that peace shall reign on earth forever. Those words remain relevant today. However, armed conflicts in various parts of the world remain a reality, and the Security Council time and again is forced to pay attention to the institutions of international humanitarian law. The nature of wars has changed. Internal armed conflicts now dominate, the main reason of which, as a rule, tends to be the undermining of statehood, including through the overthrowing of legitimate governments as a result of external interference. Selective approaches and double standards now often have an impact on the authority of IHL. And this, in turn, gives grounds for discussions about the need to uphold this branch of international law, as a rule, through some sort of declaration or additional monitoring mechanism. Moreover, in these conditions, many, depending on their political predilections, are tempted to hype up the violations of some parties and hush up the crimes of others. We are convinced that the norms of IHL should not be used as an instrument for political manipulations. Unfortunately, we've already heard an example of this situation today in the statement of our British colleague, because our country was addressed directly. I would just like to say that clearly you have some old, outdated information or you're poorly prepared, but the territory of the Russian Federation, which includes Crimea, does not have any armed conflict. And so talking about international humanitarian law as applies to our country is not appropriate. And turning to what you said about Syria, I can say that that is also not a subject for our meeting today. I would like to recall the many questions that we are putting to you and your American colleagues about what is taking place with the observation of IHL beyond the Euphrates. We repeatedly ask these questions, but we don't receive any answers to them. And it's probably now time to get down to doing so. Mr. President, we call on all states to strictly adhere to their obligations under international law, first and foremost the existing norms of international humanitarian law, which form a firm legal basis for the protection, first and foremost, of the civilian population from dangers arising as a result of military operations. As we have said repeatedly in this chamber, we are convinced that the problems of implementation lie not in the weakness of international humanitarian law, but rather in the disinclination or reluctance to implement its principles and norms in practice. Moreover, alongside the fundamentally important measures to strengthen and maintain peace and security, of equal relevance are also means that help to reduce the intensity of armed conflicts, to limit violence, and to create conditions for reconciliation and political settlement. Our country, in turn, continues unstintingly to call for the humanization of armed conflicts, but above all for their prevention. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement.